She treated me with more kindness than I'd ever known. She made me believe I had finally found peace in Cebu. But all that changed the moment I said no to buying her a condo. That was the day I realized her kindness had a price. I'm sitting here tonight, 3 months after leaving the Philippines, and I can still smell the barbecue smoke from IT Park. I can still feel Jessa's head on my shoulder as we watch the city lights flicker on like tiny stars scattered across the darkness. The heat was oppressive that evening, but with her next to me, everything felt perfect. "Mark," she whispered that night, her voice so soft it barely carried over the traffic and street vendors calling out their wares, "You make me feel so safe." I was 54 years old, twice divorced, carrying the weight of 2 failed marriages and children who barely spoke to me anymore, and suddenly I felt like a teenager again. My chest swelled with something I'd forgotten existed. Hope. Pure, undiluted hope that maybe, just maybe, life had one more chance for me. "That's good, baby," I told her, wrapping my arm tighter around her small frame, feeling how perfectly she fit against my side. "That's all I want to do. That's all I've ever wanted to do." She looked up at me with those dark eyes that seemed to hold all the warmth I'd been searching for my entire adult life. Eyes that made me believe in second chances, in fresh starts, in the possibility that love could still find a broken man like me. "I think you're the one I've been waiting for," she said, her fingers tracing small circles on my chest. The words hit me like lightning, like electricity coursing through my veins. After 2 failed marriages, after watching my own kids grow distant and cold, after years of eating dinner alone in front of the television, here was this beautiful woman telling me I mattered, that I was worth waiting for. "Really?" I asked, my voice cracking like I was 16 years old again, asking a girl to prom. "Really?" She nodded, then kissed my cheek so gently I thought I might cry right there in the middle of IT Park. That's when I thought I'd finally found the one. That's when I believed my luck had finally changed. God, I was such a fool. Let me tell you why I chose Cebu in the first place, because understanding that choice is understanding everything that came after. After my second divorce, I was broken in ways I didn't even know were possible. Not just financially, though Linda took half of everything I'd worked 30 years to build. I was emotionally gutted, spiritually bankrupt, a hollow shell of the man I used to be. My daughter Sarah hadn't called me in 6 months, and when she did, our conversations were stilted, awkward affairs that left me feeling more alone than before. My son Michael sent birthday cards but never visited, never brought the grandchildren I'd never met. I'd spent 3 decades wiring houses in Ohio, crawling through attics and basements, saving every penny, building what I thought was a secure future. And for what? To sit alone in a house that felt like a tomb, eating microwave dinners and watching reruns of shows I'd already seen 100 times? You need to start over somewhere. My buddy Carl told me over beers at Murphy's Tavern, the same dive bar where we'd been drinking since our 20s. Somewhere cheap, warm, where people still smile at strangers. He'd been to Thailand twice, had stories about beaches and friendly locals, and a cost of living that made retirement actually possible. I'd heard similar stories from other guys, men my age who'd given up on American women and American complications. So I made the decision that would change everything. I sold the house, liquidated my 4,01,000, took what was left of my retirement savings, and bought a one-way ticket to Cebu. The first month was lonely as hell, lonelier than I'd ever been in my life. I ate at the same restaurant every night, McDonald's mostly because it was familiar, wandering the malls like a lost tourist, watching families and couples and feeling like an outsider looking in. I was beginning to think I'd made a terrible mistake when my phone charger died. Such a small thing, but it changed everything. I went to the electronics counter at Ayala Mall, expecting the usual indifferent service I'd grown used to back home, and there she was. 27 years old, wearing a crisp white blouse and a smile that seemed to light up the entire counter. "What kind of phone do you have, sir?" she asked in perfect English, her voice musical, in a way that made me want to keep talking just to hear it again. When I showed her my ancient Nokia, she laughed, not mockingly but with genuine delight. "My uncle has the same one," she said, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "Very old school, very reliable, just like the men who carry them." She found me the right charger, her fingers brushing mine as she handed it over, And then she said something that stopped me cold. "You know, sir, you have kind eyes. Not many foreigners do." I should have walked away right then. Should have recognized the line for what it was. Should have understood that I was being sized up, evaluated, categorized. But I was starving for kindness, desperate for human connection, and she was serving it with both hands and a smile that made me forget every hard lesson I'd ever learned about women and money and the price of affection. For the first month with Jessa, her kindness felt like love in ways I'd almost forgotten were possible. She cooked for me every weekend, not just throwing together a quick meal, but teaching me about Filipino cuisine, showing me how to eat with my hands, laughing when I made a mess of the rice and got adobo sauce all over my fingers. "You're learning," she'd say, wiping rice from my chin with a tenderness that made my chest ache. "My Lolo would like you." He always said foreigners who try to eat properly are the good ones. She called me every morning at exactly 7 o'clock, not for money, not for favors, not because she needed something. Just to say good morning, to ask about my plans, to make sure I was taking care of myself. "Did you sleep well, Mark? Did you take your vitamins? You know you need to be careful in this heat." No woman had asked about my vitamins in 15 years. Linda certainly never had, too busy with her yoga classes and book clubs and the gardening that became more important than our marriage. She took me to meet her family at a birthday party in Lahug, introducing me to cousins and aunts and uncles with a pride that made me stand taller. I was the only foreigner there, the only white face in a sea of brown, but she made sure I felt welcome, translating jokes, explaining traditions, including me in conversations about family and work and the everyday concerns that make up a life. "This is Mark," she told everyone who would listen. "He's very special to me." Her cousin Maria pulled me aside later, after I'd bought several rounds of San Miguel for everyone and was feeling the warm glow of acceptance. "Jessa talks about you all the time," she said, her voice sincere. "She says you're different from the other foreigners who come here." "Different how?" I wanted to ask but was afraid to break the spell. "You don't make her feel like a trophy," Maria continued. "You make her feel like a person. Like someone worth knowing, not just someone worth having." I bought more beer that night, feeling proud and protective and part of something bigger than myself for the first time in years. On the jeepney ride home, Jessa held my hand, her fingers intertwined with mine, and I felt like the luckiest man alive. "You know what I love about you, Mark?" she asked, her head resting on my shoulder as the city rolled past us in a blur of lights and noise. "What's that, baby?" "You don't just want me for tonight. You want me for tomorrow, too. You want me to be part of your life, not just your vacation." She was right. I did want her for tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day for the rest of my life. "One day," she said, looking out at the high-rise condos along Lahug that gleamed like beacons in the darkness, "I want a place that's really ours. Somewhere we can build something real, something that lasts." I squeezed her hand tighter, the word ours, making my heart race with possibilities I'd thought were dead and buried. This was what I'd come to the Philippines to find. This was what I'd been missing all those lonely years in Ohio. The first requests started so small I barely noticed them, so natural they felt like part of being in a relationship rather than warning signs I should have heeded. "Mark, I'm embarrassed to ask, but can you help with my brother's tuition?" she said one evening after we'd made love, her voice hesitant, almost ashamed. "It's only 15,000 pesos, and I'm short this month. My salary doesn't come until next week." Of course I could help. Family was important to her, more important than anything, and I wanted to be part of that family, wanted to prove that I understood Filipino values, that I could be the kind of man who took care of his woman's relatives. 15,000 pesos was less than $300. Nothing to me, everything to a kid trying to get an education. A week later, she needed money for groceries. Her salary was delayed, she said, some problem with the company's payroll system. Could I cover it just this once? Another week, her phone was broken, dropped on the concrete outside the mall, and she needed a new one for work. Could I help her out? Each request came with apologies, with promises to pay me back, with explanations that made perfect sense. Nothing felt wrong because nothing was wrong. These weren't demands or ultimatums or the cold calculations I'd learned to recognize later. They were gentle requests from someone who cooked for me, called me every day, made me feel alive and needed, and appreciated for the first time in years. But then Maria started talking about her new condo during one of those family dinners where I'd become a regular fixture. "My boyfriend Gary bought it for me," she said, her voice full of pride as she showed photos on her phone. "It's in It Park, 26th floor, 2 bedrooms, marble countertops." I watched how Jessa's eyes lingered on those photos, how her fingers traced the granite surfaces on the screen, how her smile got tight and forced when Maria talked about security and investment and thinking about the future. "That's nice," I said, trying to sound casual, but feeling something cold and uncomfortable creep into my stomach. "Gary says it's the smart thing to do," Maria continued, oblivious to the tension that was building at our table. "He says real men don't just think about today. They think about tomorrow. They think about building something permanent." Jessa nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving the photos. "Very smart," she agreed, then looked directly at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Don't you think so, Mark? Don't you think smart men plan for the future?" I laughed it off, made some joke about being too old to be smart about anything, but that night I couldn't sleep. The word investment kept echoing in my head, along with the memory of how Jessa had stared at those photos, how her breathing had changed when Maria talked about marble countertops and city views, and the security that comes with owning something permanent in a world where nothing ever feels permanent. The condo conversation happened on a Tuesday evening that started like any other, but ended with everything changed forever. Jessa had cooked my favorite meal, chicken adobo with extra rice and those little green vegetables she knew I was trying to learn to like. She'd lit candles, put on soft music, created the kind of romantic atmosphere that usually meant we'd spend the evening talking about our future together. But something felt different from the moment I walked into her small apartment. She was nervous, fidgeting with her hands, avoiding eye contact in a way that made my stomach clench with anxiety. "Mark, we need to talk about something serious," she said after we'd finished eating, her voice carrying a weight that made me put down my fork and give her my full attention. "What is it, baby? You're scaring me." She took a deep breath, the kind people take before jumping off cliffs or delivering bad news or asking for things they're not sure they'll get. "If you really love me, you'll help me get a condo." The words hit me like a physical blow, like someone had reached into my chest and squeezed my heart with an icy fist. "A condo?" I repeated, my voice sounding strange and distant in my own ears. "It's not just for me, Mark," she said quickly, leaning forward across the small table, her eyes bright with an intensity I'd never seen before. "It's for us, for our future, for the life we're going to build together." She had it all planned out, had clearly been thinking about this for weeks, maybe months. I found one in Lahug, near where Maria lives. 2 bedrooms, 24th floor, partial ocean view. Only 3.5 million pesos. My mouth went dry. 3.5 million pesos. I did the quick conversion in my head, the math I'd learned to do automatically after months of living in the Philippines. Roughly $65,000, my entire retirement savings, everything I had left after the divorce, after the lawyers, after starting over at 54 with nothing but Social Security and a small pension to look forward to. "Jessa, I can't afford that," I stammered, feeling like I was disappointing her in some fundamental way. "My retirement doesn't work that way. I don't have that kind of money just sitting around." Her face changed then, the warmth and vulnerability disappearing like a mask being removed. "It's an investment, Mark, for both of us. We'll own it together. Your name can be on the title too. But I can't just spend my entire life savings on cells. Other men do it for their girlfriends all the time," she interrupted, her voice taking on an edge I'd never heard before. "Maria's Gary did it. Sarah's boyfriend bought her one in Mactan. Jenny's American husband just bought her a 3-bedroom in Lahug. They understand what it means to invest in the future." The way she said other men made me feel small and inadequate, like I was failing some test I didn't even know I was taking. "I love you, Jessa, but I can't spend my entire retirement on me?" Her voice turned cold, arctic, cutting through the warm evening air like a blade. "On us, you mean? On our future together?" I felt panic rising in my chest, the desperate terror of losing something precious, something I'd thought was permanent. "That's not what I meant. You know that's not what I meant." But it was too late. She'd already pulled away, physically and emotionally, her body language closing off like shutters slamming shut. "Maybe you need time to think about what's really important to you," she said, standing up from the table with a finality that made my stomach drop. "Maybe you need to think about whether you're serious about us, about building something real, or if you're just here for fun like all the other tourists." The word tourists stung because it reduced everything we'd shared to something cheap and temporary. "Jessa, please. I think you should go home tonight, Mark. Think about what I've said. Think about what kind of man you want to be." I drove back to my apartment in a daze, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, replaying every word of the conversation and wondering how something so beautiful had turned so cold so quickly. The cracks in her kindness appeared immediately, like a dam bursting under pressure that had been building for months. The morning calls stopped without explanation or goodbye. When I tried calling her, she'd answer with a tired, distant, "Hello, Mark," instead of her usual, "Good morning, baby. How did you sleep?" When I asked what was wrong, she'd say nothing, everything was fine, she was just busy with work and family obligations. She canceled our weekend plans with increasingly flimsy excuses. "I'm not feeling well," she'd say. "Maybe next week." Or, "My cousin needs help moving. Rain check?" When we did manage to see each other, she seemed distracted, always checking her phone, responding to texts with secretive smiles that made my chest ache with jealousy and confusion. "Who are you texting?" I asked once, trying to keep my voice light and casual. "Just friends," she replied without looking up, her fingers flying across the screen. No one important, but the way she angled the phone away from me suggested otherwise. I felt like I was losing her inch by inch, day by day, and I didn't understand why. The condo conversation had lasted maybe 30 minutes. We'd been together for 4 months. 4 months of daily calls and weekend cooking sessions and meeting each other's families. How could one know change everything? How could refusing to buy property turn love into indifference? One evening, while waiting for her outside the mall, I overheard her talking to Maria on the phone, speaking in rapid Bisaya, not knowing I'd picked up enough of the language to understand the basics. "He doesn't want to build a future," she was saying, her voice frustrated and disappointed. "Maybe he's not serious about me. Maybe he's just like all the others, looking for cheap fun." My chest tightened with a mixture of hurt and anger. I was serious. I'd never been more serious about anyone in my life. I'd moved halfway around the world, learned a new language, adapted to a new culture, integrated myself into her family. But serious didn't mean stupid, did it? Serious didn't mean spending every penny I had on a condo I couldn't afford in a country where I had no legal rights. I started second-guessing everything that had happened between us. The way she'd introduced me to her family with such pride. The way she'd talked about our future in vague, dreamy terms that I'd interpreted as romantic but now seemed calculating. Had it all been leading to this moment? Had every kiss, every laugh, every gentle touch been part of some elaborate plan to get me emotionally invested enough to hand over my life savings? I didn't want to believe it. Couldn't bear to think that everything beautiful between us had been a lie, but the evidence was mounting. Her coldness, her distance, the way she looked at me now, like I'd disappointed her in some fundamental way, like I'd broken a promise I didn't even know I'd made. The breaking point came when I decided to surprise her at work, hoping that maybe seeing her in person would break through whatever wall had grown between us. I bought flowers from the elderly vendor outside Ayala Mall, the same woman who'd sold me roses for Jessa's birthday, and walked through the crowds toward the electronics counter where we'd first met. But she wasn't there. "She's at lunch," her coworker said, pointing vaguely toward the food court. "Try the second level." I found her at a corner table near the windows, sitting across from another foreign man. White hair, probably my age, wearing the kind of polo shirt and khaki pants that screamed American retiree on vacation. They were laughing about something, their heads close together in the way that suggested intimacy, familiarity, the kind of easy conversation that comes from knowing someone well. My stomach turned to ice water. I stood there for a moment, holding those stupid flowers, watching the woman I loved flirt with another man, and felt something fundamental break inside my chest. I walked over on unsteady legs, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it over the food court noise. "Jessa?" She looked up, startled, guilt flashing across her face before being quickly replaced by defensive anger. "Mark, what are you doing here?" "I brought you flowers," I said stupidly, still holding the wilted bouquet like some kind of peace offering. The other man looked uncomfortable, clearly sensing the tension. "I'm Bill," he said, extending his hand in a gesture that felt more like a challenge than a greeting. "Nice to meet you." "This is Mark," Jessa said quickly, and I noticed she didn't use any of the usual terms of endearment, didn't identify our relationship. "My friend. Friend. Not boyfriend. Not the man she'd been sleeping with for 4 months. Not the man who'd met her family and learned her language and fallen so completely in love that he'd considered spending his retirement savings just to make her happy. Friend. Bill was just telling me about his new place in ID Park," she continued, her voice too bright, too cheerful, like she was overcompensating for something. "He just bought a beautiful condo there, 2 bedrooms, ocean view." Of course he had. Of course Bill had done exactly what I couldn't or wouldn't do. I felt the flowers slip from my numb fingers, heard them hit the tile floor with a wet sound that seemed impossibly loud. "Can I talk to you privately?" I managed to ask, my voice sounding foreign in my own ears. She followed me to a quieter corner near the restrooms, her face set in lines of defiant irritation. "Who is he, Jessa?" I asked, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice. "He's just a friend, Mark. A friend who knows how to invest in the future." The way she emphasized invest was like a slap across the face. "Are you seeing him?" The question hung between us like a loaded gun. "If you can't give me stability, maybe someone else will," she said coldly, her dark eyes hard as stones. "Someone who understands what it means to build something real, something permanent." There it was. The truth I'd been avoiding for weeks, delivered with surgical precision. Her kindness had been conditional all along. Her love had come with a price tag clearly marked, and I'd been too blinded by loneliness and hope to read the fine print. "Jessa, I love you," I said, hearing how pathetic I sounded. "Doesn't that count for anything? Love doesn't pay rent, Mark. Love doesn't buy security. Love doesn't build the future I want." She turned and walked back to Bill's table, leaving me standing there among the lunch crowd, holding nothing but the bitter taste of betrayal and the crushing weight of my own stupidity. I made one last desperate plea the next evening, showing up at her apartment in La Hogue unannounced, hoping against hope that maybe I could salvage something from the wreckage of what I'd thought was love. She lived with 3 roommates in a cramped space that smelled of cooking oil and cheap perfume, sharing a single bathroom and sleeping on a narrow bed that we'd somehow made feel like paradise during those early weeks when everything seemed possible. "Jessa, please, can we talk?" I asked when she answered the door, noting how she kept her body positioned to block my view inside, like I'd lost the right to enter her private space. She let me in reluctantly, but her body language was closed off, defensive, arms crossed over her chest, standing near the door like she was ready for me to leave at any moment. "I can't buy you a condo," I said, my voice breaking on the words. "I wish I could. I wish I was the kind of man who could make grand gestures and solve all your problems with money. But I can't. What I can do is take care of you in other ways. I can help with your family when they need it. I can be here for you. I can love you with everything I have. Isn't that enough?" She looked at me with something that might have been pity, or sadness, or just exhaustion at having to explain something so obvious to someone so dense. "Mark, you're a good man," she said, her voice gentler than it had been in weeks. "I do care about you, but caring doesn't change reality." "What reality?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The reality that I'm 27 years old and I work retail for 12,000 pesos a month. The reality that I live in this tiny room with 3 other women and share a bathroom that barely works. The reality that my parents are getting older and need medical care that I can't afford. The reality that I want children someday, and I want them to have opportunities I never had." Her voice grew stronger, more confident, like she was finally being honest about things she'd been thinking for months. "You're a good man, Mark, but good doesn't pay for the future I want. Good doesn't lift me out of this life. So, what am I to you?" I asked, though asking the question felt like pressing on a fresh wound. "You're someone I enjoyed spending time with. Someone who made me feel special for a while. But you're not my future, Mark. You can't be. I'll always care for you." I pressed on, desperate now, grasping at straws. "Doesn't that count for something? Doesn't the time we spent together mean anything?" She sighed, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of the woman who used to call me every morning, who used to laugh at my terrible attempts to speak Tagalog. But then it was gone, replaced by someone harder, more practical, more focused on survival than sentiment. "Maybe you're not the man I thought you were," she said quietly, walking toward the door. "Maybe I need someone who can match my ambitions, not just my present circumstances." That was it. No screaming, no drama, no thrown objects or slammed doors, just a quiet dismissal that cut deeper than any argument could have. She opened the door and stood beside it, waiting for me to leave. "Goodbye, Mark." I stood there for a long moment, looking at this woman I'd thought I knew, this woman I'd thought loved me, trying to memorize her face one last time. "Goodbye, Jessa." I walked out of her apartment and out of her life, and never saw her again. Sitting alone in my hotel room that night, surrounded by the remnants of a life I'd tried to build in a foreign country, I did the math on our relationship like an accountant totaling up a failed business venture. The tuition for her brother that I'd paid without question, 20,000 pesos. The groceries during her salary delays that seemed to happen with suspicious frequency, another 15,000. The new phone after her old one mysteriously broke, 8,000. The dinners, the gifts for her family, the transportation costs, the endless small emergencies that always seemed to require my financial intervention, probably 50,000 more. In 4 months, I'd spent nearly 100,000 pesos on a woman who'd walked away the moment I couldn't deliver the big prize, almost $2,000. Money I'd given freely, happily, because I thought it was building something real, something lasting. But it wasn't building anything. It was just maintenance. Monthly payments on a relationship that was always going to have an expiration date tied to my bank account balance. I wasn't her boyfriend. I was her client. And when I couldn't upgrade to premium service, when I couldn't provide the luxury package she really wanted, she found someone who could. The worst part wasn't the money, though losing $2,000 hurt on a fixed income. The worst part was realizing I'd seen the warning signs and ignored them all. The way her eyes lit up whenever someone mentioned property or investments. The way she always steered our conversations toward the future without ever defining what that future looked like in practical terms. The way her affection seemed to ebb and flow in direct proportion to my willingness to spend money on her and her family. I'd been so starved for companionship, so grateful for her attention, so desperate to believe that someone could love a broken-down electrician from Ohio, that I'd mistaken a business transaction for a love story. She'd been auditioning investors, and I'd failed the audition. Her kindness hadn't been free. It had come with a price tag clearly marked at 3.5 million pesos, and I'd been too poor or too smart or too stubborn to pay it. I stayed in Cebu another week, trying to make sense of what had happened, walking through the places where we'd been happy together and wondering how I'd misread the signs so completely. I ate at our favorite restaurants alone, remembering how she used to laugh at my pronunciation of Filipino words, how she used to steal bites from my plate when she thought I wasn't looking. I walked through IT Park in the evenings, past the high-rise condos that gleamed like monuments to other men's generosity, other men's ability to buy love with real estate. Part of me hoped I'd run into her, that we could talk things through like adults, find some middle ground between her dreams and my limitations. But I knew that was fantasy. There was no middle ground between love and business, no compromise between emotional connection and financial transaction. On my last night in Cebu, I sat at the same outdoor restaurant where she'd told me I made her feel safe, where I'd felt like the luckiest man alive just a few months earlier. The memory felt like a lie now, but I couldn't entirely dismiss it. Maybe she had felt safe with me, for a while. Maybe her kindness had been genuine, even if it was conditional. Maybe we'd both gotten caught up in our own fantasies and lost sight of reality. Mine was the fantasy of finding true love in a foreign country, of starting over at 54 with a beautiful young woman who'd appreciate my stability and maturity. Hers was the fantasy of finding a foreign man wealthy enough to lift her out of poverty and into the comfortable middle-class life she'd always wanted. Neither of us got what we were really looking for. I don't hate Jessa, even now. I hope she found what she was searching for, whether it was Bill or someone else with deeper pockets and fewer hang-ups about mixing love and real estate investment. I hope she got her condo and her security and the future she'd planned so carefully. But I learned something about myself in those painful weeks after she walked away. I learned that I can't buy love, no matter how much I want to, no matter how lonely I get, no matter how desperate I am for human connection. Real love doesn't come with a payment plan or a down payment or monthly maintenance fees. Real love doesn't have a price tag attached. The flight back to Ohio was the longest 12 hours of my life. Sitting in that cramped economy seat with my knees pressed against the seat in front of me, looking out at clouds and ocean and thinking about everything I'd lost. Not just the money, though that hurt more than I wanted to admit. Not just Jessa, though I'd loved her more deeply than I'd loved anyone since my first marriage fell apart. I'd lost something harder to define but more important than either of those things. I'd lost my faith in my own judgment, my ability to read people and situations, my confidence that I could navigate the complex world of relationships without making a fool of myself. How could a man my age, with 2 marriages and 54 years of life experience behind him, fall for such an obvious setup? How could I have been so blind to what was happening right in front of me? But as the plane crossed the Pacific and America grew larger on the horizon, something shifted in my thinking. Maybe I hadn't been entirely wrong about Jessa. Maybe her kindness had been real, even if it was motivated by practical concerns. Maybe her feelings for me had been genuine, even if they weren't strong enough to overcome her need for financial security. Life isn't a Hollywood movie where love conquers all. People aren't just heroes and villains, saints and sinners. They're complicated, driven by fears and desires and circumstances that outsiders can never fully understand. A 27-year-old woman working retail in the Philippines, supporting her family on a salary that wouldn't pay for groceries in America, has different priorities than a 54-year-old retired electrician from Ohio with a pension and Social Security. That doesn't make either of us villains. It just makes us incompatible in ways that kindness and affection couldn't bridge. But here's what I learned, and here's what I want anyone listening to understand if they're thinking about following the path I took. If you meet someone overseas who seems too kind, too perfect, too eager to build a future with you after just a few weeks or months, ask yourself one fundamental question. Can you afford the price of that kindness? Because it will have a price. Maybe not a condo, maybe not 3.5 million pesos, but it will cost you something. Your savings, your self-respect, your ability to trust your own instincts about people and relationships. Make sure you understand what you're buying before you fall in love with someone who's selling something you can't afford. I'm back in Ohio now, renting a small apartment in the same town where I grew up, trying to rebuild what I lost and figure out what comes next. The weather is cold and the people are distant and everything costs twice what it should, but at least I understand the rules here. I won't say I regret going to the Philippines. I won't say I regret meeting Jessa. For 4 months, I felt alive and appreciated and loved in ways I hadn't experienced in years. That has to count for something. Those feelings were real, even if they were built on a foundation that couldn't support the weight of different expectations and incompatible dreams. But I'll never again mistake kindness for love. I'll never again try to buy what should be freely given. And I'll never again ignore the voice in my head that whispers warnings when something seems too good to be true. If you're thinking about following my path, if you're lonely enough and desperate enough to believe that love is waiting for you in some exotic location with beautiful women and low cost of living, just remember this story. Remember that kindness often comes with a price tag. Remember that love and business don't mix well. And remember that the most expensive thing you can buy is something that isn't really for sale. Her kindness had a price. I couldn't afford it, and neither can you.